Welcome back. It's Swing Pass. We've got a brand new host. We've got a ton to talk about with the 2025 season under 60 days away now. Hi, everyone. I'm Adam Ruffner, and I am now joined by Evan Lepler as my new co-host of Swing Pass. Evan, welcome aboard.
Adam, thank you. It is an honor to finally be asked to appear on the elite Swing Pass podcast, and I feel like this is our worlds colliding a little bit. You know, I did the AUDL podcast for a time, but this is the new era. This is the ultimate Frisbee Association, and I'm excited to go back and forth, to debate, to discuss, to think and contemplate, and we certainly got plenty to talk about just less than 2 months away from the start of the 2025 season. So, yeah, thanks for having me, and I'm really excited to get started.
I think you forgot a bicker, argue, storm off the show. And by the way, this is a good segue. That's not what happened to me and Cameron Brock, our most illustrious and recent co-hosts. I know I'm kind of chewing through some of the people that I talked to with on this podcast, but with Cameron joining Atlanta, becoming a travel player, having a young family, in addition to having like a job and 1,000 other responsibilities, we just thought this would be a more, I think, workable agreement. Cameron will still probably be appearing in some sort of column form, giving us updates as he campaigns his way through the 2025 season with his new team, The Hustle. And they're going to be a feature team at the center of many of our primetime broadcasts. So we're going to be talking about them a lot. But Evan is now actually a full-time employee of the league too for the first time in his career. So that's a big part of why we want to get him more involved. And I guess we could say we want your 2 cents. I don't know if we want to go that far, but you know,
I got way more than 2 cents, as you know. And well, look, you had Daniel, who had 0 UFA goals. You had Cam, who had more than anybody, and now you go back to someone who's tied for the fewest goals scored in the history of the UFA. So there's a nice kind of symmetry there.
There is. I'm also holding steady at the 0. We'll see how that works out for our media personas. But dude, we've got so much to get to. There's been so much news. I know we kind of already talked about a few weeks ago with Cam and I breaking the news of Alec Wilson-Holiday, last year's league leader in goals, joining the Atlanta Hustle. We talked briefly about Minnesota adding Justin Burnett and James Pollard, but there's obviously just been a cavalcade of other news. Chicago has brought back Pavlianis, Nate Goff, as well as a majority of their 2022 championship game appearance roster, as well as adding what appears to be the top European male player in Don de Marais. He's going to be a standout player, I think, as a rookie for the Union this year. You've got this recharged rush team that's also bringing in a bunch of Euro talent, as well as former stars from their past. But I think what we really want to kick off this episode talking about is this athlete who's joining the league, and I think is a caliber beyond what we've even sort of glimpsed. And that, yeah.
Well, one of my pet peeves is using the phrase "kick off" when we talk about Ultimate. I try to use, we should launch this podcast rather, but I'm okay with you using it today.
Okay.
For obvious reasons.
And those reasons would be, do you want to do it? You should do the honors. You should.
No, you're the host of the show, Adam. I'm just here to correct you.
It's a co-host deal, Evan. It's a co-host deal. This is where I schlep off suddenly things that I don't want to do. That's why I put the co in front. It's very useful for me. It's a load-bearing prefix. Anyways, to the important news, and kicking off our news is this absolutely monumental signing that the Colorado Summit have kind of come out of nowhere with. They add a former NFL wide receiver, Rodney Adams, for the 2025 season. And I want to be careful in my words, but this is an athlete and a kind of disciplined professional sports player that this league, and I doubt even this sport, has even really ever seen before. I mean, this is a guy who's actually made it to the show in arguably the most competitive professional sports landscape in the world in the National Football League. He's a true 4.4 40 runner. He was a special teamer for the Bears. You can go look up his highlights on YouTube. He was a South Florida legend, it looks like. I mean, what's your initial take on this? I know I have kind of my enthusiasm and hype, but I'm interested to hear what you sort of discovered. You talked to him this week. You've talked with Jakeem Polk, another football convert. What's your assessment of this monumental signing for Colorado?
I called it a historic day for the league, and I think it is, though I don't think that's Rodney Adams or the Colorado Summit's goal. I think the Summit are looking to get a guy that can contribute, and Rodney is looking to scratch that competitive itch and see what he can do. And I think more than anything, like, people are asking, why is Rodney doing this? Because he thinks it's going to be fun. Why do any of us play Ultimate? Like, we're not doing it for the glory or the riches. More often than not, almost unanimously, that's not the case in this sport right now. So you're doing it because it's fun. It's fun to be a part of a team. It's fun to compete and see what you can do, and to travel and, you know, make a few bucks on the side. And I think for Rodney, who, you know, spent a bunch of years in the NFL, had some personal struggles along the way, had some tragedy in his life that impacted his football career in several ways, but now he's living his best life. He's got 2 daughters. He's got another one on the way. He just moved out to Colorado, where his wife is from, and to be around her family and to have a little bit of extra help from the grandparents. I certainly empathize with that. And he's just excited to see what it can do. And it's just kind of a perfect storm for the Colorado Summit to be in this position. And they're really, really excited. Like, Tim Kafalas and Quinn Finer, I talked to both of them this past week, and they are both, like, trying to slow play it a little bit, their excitement, but also just kind of giddy about what it could be. And look, you and I were talking off air. I don't think Rodney Adams is going to be a game changer in season 1, but I think the biggest part of this story is just, it's like Bill Belichick going to North Carolina. It's just relentlessly interesting, whether it's successful or it doesn't go well, or it looks awkward, or it's a slam dunk. It's relentlessly interesting. It's great for the league. It helps give us more exposure. Maybe some other former football players see him have some success and think, I could do that too. Like, this is the next step. And whether it works out or not, it is a historic day, because we will always remember, and it will always be noteworthy, the day that a pro athlete from another sport of the caliber of the National Football League joined the Ultimate Frisbee Association for the first time. And, you know, with all respect to Jakeem Polk and Marquise Mason and some of the other top athletes we've had, Rodney Adams is different. He was drafted 170th overall. You know, Tom Brady was the 199th overall pick many, many, many years earlier. So, look,
how did you get a Tom Brady reference within the first 10 minutes on this show? I'm so upset.
Well, it came after the Belichick reference, so you can expect a lot more of that.
I know. I'm already letting way too much sports guy nor'easter stuff fly here in your opening segment, but you're speaking well. Continue.
What was your immediate reaction the first you heard of it?
I think it's very similar to what you were describing with TK and Quinn Finer. I've even kind of talked a little bit with TK about it. It's that understanding that immediately he's the best prospect any of us has ever seen, just stepping up and cleaning up. Like, there is nothing anyone has ever seen just, like, approach the field. And that's before he touches a disc. And I don't just mean his athleticism. Again, as I kind of said before, his approach as an athlete is so far beyond what any of us consider the standard right now, that I just think him kind of glimpsing the sport with the sincerity that I think he's approaching these first few practices is already kind of landmark. Like you're saying, we know this day as being like the day Rodney joined the league. I think it's also just having somebody who already has like a grad level understanding of, again, one of the hardest professional sports there is. He was joking with TK. TK was talking about like, hey, do you want to run some plays? And Rodney kind of quit back. Yeah, man, they give us a 70-page playbook like day one. Like, let's run through a couple of plays. You can throw a couple of things at me. Like, this is somebody whose mind works at a level and a speed that I don't think we're accustomed to seeing intake the sport. And so I know it's this whole thing of he's never really thrown a disc before. He's got the barbecue backhand form on some of those original videos. But like this dude and how he approaches things, we've never seen that. Like this is totally off the map. And so you just talk about like that level of prospect. I mean, the bar's up here. But to your point, I just don't know where that hype encounters the reality, right? Like where is his sort of rubber meets the road moment? Like I think there's going to be a lot of glimpses, and I wouldn't be surprised if it's immediate in the first game. You have just a couple of impact wow moments from him, whether it's on defense, making a read, or on offense, just showcasing his, again, legit 4.4 speed. Like there's no one who can touch him in a straight line in this league. Like not even close. It's just going to be eating dust for everyone if he puts his head down. Like if you see glimpses of that, what's that going to be? I just don't know what it translates to, right? Like, is it a 20 block season? Is it 40 goals on offense? Is it becoming a discernible part of a foundational aspect of a playoff team by the time the season ends? I don't know. But I know that like this is kind of the way forward, right? Like this is sort of what you and I and everyone else sort of ideate behind the scenes is like, man, wouldn't it be cool if somebody with all these tools kind of came in and showed us how to play a little bit differently? And I do think Adams has that ability, like right out the gate from discussing things with the Colorado people. Like they're all like, he's taking to this stuff immediately. And I'm just so excited for that. Like, I think that's just where I'm continuing to stay throttled. It's like, I'm just excited about this. Like, this is just cool news.
It's super exciting, but multiple things can be true at the same time, right? Like he can be taking to it really quickly and he can be as coachable as TK and Quinn say he is. And it also might take some time.
Yeah.
And look, the biggest news this week was Rodney Adams joining the Colorado Summit. The biggest impact to the Summit winning in 2025 might have been Keenan Lawrence joining the Colorado Summit. Like that news got absolutely brushed under. And Tobias Brooks, like you said,
I was
like
going to say, Tobias Brooks is where my mind went immediately because I see him as being like next in terms of like the entire sport. And again, talking with TK and people, he has that approach, that mindset that we talk about so often that's so elusive. Like I think Brooks has that, but you're right, man. Like Keenan Lawrence didn't play for Oakland last year. He was kind of, like if you were to do a ranked ballot in 2023, you could have put him in like a top 15 MVP candidate for how important he was to that Spiders team. Mm-hmm. Let's talk about Lawrence for a second. I think the most interesting question for him is sort of this problem of many that Colorado's approaching, which is who's going to start on this offense? I mean, Lawrence is ostensibly an offensive player and kind of finisher as a receiver. He's got some great throws, but I think given his size and his ability to read downfield, he makes his most impact in the end zone as a receiver. But like you start going through this Colorado offense, you've already got Atkins, Feiner, not-named Fink is back this week. They just announced him. Tobias Brooks, Noah Kuhlman, if he reprises last year, his role as a dynamic playmaker. You're already at 5 players. Is Keenan Lawrence, that's 6'7"? Do they bring in more throwing? Is it Matty Jackson being like a connector piece as a veteran? Is it Rodney Adams just running wind sprints up and down the sideline and tiring everyone else and scaring everyone to death? Like, there's a lot, I think, for the Summit to work with here. And I'm interested to see what rotations they figure out. Because one of the things that they did struggle with last year was they had all this talent, but how many times did Colorado trot out the same O-line the same number of weeks, right? Like twice, 3 straight.
Yeah, and how often was there a Jonathan Nethercutt-sized hole in the Summit O-line in terms of a center handler? And Nutt's not going to be a part of it this year. So, look, they have a ton of talent. And the interesting dynamic is TK, who's been primarily the defensive coordinator the past few years, he's switching over and leading the offense this year. And it's kind of the veteran captains of the team that are going to be, my understanding, leading the defense. So, look, the guys like Matty Jackson and Sandy Brown and Saeed Semrin, and so it's going to be a team story for the Summit. I think. Look, if we can get back to Rodney Adams for just a second, I think it's absolutely worth having him as the 20th guy on your roster in April and May and June.
Every week. I'm sorry. Like, if there's a debate about like getting reps between somebody else and the former NFL prospect, I'm sorry, kid, take a seat. It's Rodney's time. Like, he's getting last call on every single opportunity they have. At least us, but I'm not.
I also think that, as I said, it's going to take time. And I do think in ultimate, we overestimate how a great athlete could translate into our game, because disc skills take incredible detail and refinement and repetition.
But
and
this is the NFL thing again. Like, he made the NFL. You don't just get to that league on athleticism anymore. It is the athletes' league. Like, he has different kinds of abilities to learn a sport, I think. Then again, anything we've seen. I'm not trying to discredit what you're saying about the disc skills. I do think that learning curve is going to be pretty exponential. But if we're to doubt like the athlete who can come in and learn, like, I just don't know that Rodney is the example of that. Like, again, he has like a grad level education in sports discipline.
I think he'll be really just a daunting presence on defense early in the season. I would be surprised if he had a game with more than 2 or 3 completions. I just don't think he'll either catch goals or he'll catch the disc and a timeout will be called. And look, we see that, and that's okay. That could be his role. But and look, how many times have we seen defenses, like, he's going to be the type of cutter, like, peak Bo Kittredge or peak Jeff Babbitt or Ben Yant.
Again, we were sharing highlights, man. Like, Rodney's not just like kind of fast. He's like top 5 fastest dude on the field at all times fast. Like, house call waiting to happen if he gets it north-south. Like,
but how many times has he read a huck?
Totally.
How many times has he judged? And that is, especially in the altitude, which is different than everywhere else, and he'll be practicing in the altitude and then going elsewhere if he travels on the road. So, to go play at San Diego, and they're not in the same division anymore, but, to go play at Seattle, the disc will fly differently, and reading a disc in Seattle is different than reading a disc in Denver. And yeah, I'm super excited. I think it's really interesting. I want to caution folks from expecting him to be like a dominant force. And like, how many guys in the league, Adam, got 20 blocks last year? 3? 2?
2 maybe. Ambrose and did Ruben Miller, maybe one other.
Ruben Miller. But like, I don't expect him to get 20 blocks in year one. If he could get 10 blocks, that would be good. It's hard to get blocks in the UFA.
So, like, what do we mean then when we say impact? Because to me, he is the kind of player that if this is a playoff team, that's the best X factor, of any franchise this year. You get to the playoffs, Rodney's starting to feel it a little bit. Maybe he's not, distributing, but maybe you can trust him with like double-digit passes and he's just able to redistribute with both hands. I used to play with a D1 soccer player. She had the similar sort of learning curve with throwing, but we just taught her how to ambidextrously reset. Do you know how dangerous she was as an opening cutter? No one could stay in front of her. No one knew what to do with her. She was an athlete outside of the spectrum of recreational ultimate, right? And all she had to do was figure out how to get the disc 3 yards to somebody who can throw. This Colorado team has that ability, and Rodney's clearly the kind of competitor to understand that stuff. I guess I'm just wondering, like, what would be impactful? Like, yeah, I again, as I kind of started out the segment saying, I don't know that the production numbers will be there, but like, I kind of almost think back to like Justin Burnett's impact against New York last year, where like, yeah, he didn't touch the disc 30 times. He made the 3 most impactful plays of the entire night, though, and broke a 31-game historic winning streak in the process with the hustle. And I just see like Rodney being able to do something like that. Yeah, maybe he's not amassing 300 total yards and scoring 5 goals. Is he getting two just absolutely bonanza plays and otherwise just terrifying anyone in his vicinity? Yeah. Like, Quinn Finer is one of the quickest players in our sport, if not in the contention for like the quickest first step right now.
It's really good.
Did you see Rodney moving in comparison with Quinn a little bit? Like, it's different, man. He's just different.
Quinn's coming off a little bit of a hamstring, maybe not 100%. Yeah. So let's just throw a little cold water on that. Like, look,
it's middle of winter. I'm not trying to think. No. Quinn Finer is one of the best players in the world.
It's
no shade.
It's super exciting, and it's going to draw a lot of eyeballs. And the 20-minute conversation I had with Rodney, like, number one, I was going to say I don't think the eyeballs are like going to put pressure on him. I think he'll be pretty chill and absorb any of that. But at the same time, like
stadiums, he's got his own Instagram profile that's already got a couple thousand followers. What are we?
Doesn't mean professional athletes don't feel pressure and feel eyeballs when everybody's on them. But I also think like he also doesn't have an understanding of how meaningful this is to the ultimate community. Nor should
I think he does. No, I thought that was some of the best parts of your reporting was how he kind of indicated this is so competitive. I didn't have an appreciation for it, but I'm really hitting the ground running. Like,
well, I think he recognizes, that it's not going to be easy. He's not, but like, the point is, I don't think he while he's watched clips, like he hasn't listened to Swing Pass. He hasn't listened to Deep Look.
I mean,
he doesn't have a
really
sense.
Up a river without a paddle, Evan. I mean, without my assistance, Lord knows where he would end up.
Look, there's an ultimate narrative out there that, for better or worse, he is just totally innocent to. He's never experienced it before. So
that could be his blessing, right? Like,
sure.
Maybe he doesn't need all of that baggage.
Well, I'm not saying he does. My broader point is, like, if you could choose to add Nate Goff to your team or Rodney Adams to your team for the 2025 season, you're taking Nate Goff, guy who played for Team USA in the World Games.
You are. Hey, you didn't ask me. You are. I like Nate Goff a lot. But I don't know, man. Like, again, it's the best prospect we've ever seen. Period. Like that.
No, he's never completed a flick before in a game. He's never played 7-on-7 Ultimate Frisbee before.
Jeff Babbitt threw like 30 forward passes last year and won the MVP. Okay, like I love throwing as much as the next person, but you can be impactful in a lot of ways in the Ultimate Field. It's one of my favorite parts about watching Jeff Babbitt play is that, and it's not to say he's not a good thrower. He's a good thrower. He just doesn't do much with it. We gotta move on.
You're saying you'd rather have Rodney Adams for the 2025 season than Nate Goff?
I just don't want to say it into a microphone and you cornering me on it. No, right now, no. Check back in with me on Memorial Day weekend when Rodney strings together some crazy like 5.55 stat line on 10 completions, but just no one is able to stay in front of him. So
I was also trying to tee you up for the segue.
Well, I'll just block into it. It's fine. The segue is the Chicago, I think. In my mind, how I was going to segue it is, Rodney Adams is kind of this unrealized talent. I feel like Chicago has been the same thing in this league. And now with this kind of full roster reprisal of what they had in 2022, plus some really interesting other additions, including Brandon Van Dusen, the formerly mentioned Demare. This Union team on paper appears to be the most talented team in the league right now. I just, again, similar to Rodney Adams, wonder what happens when the rubber meets the road. This Chicago team has been here before in this way. In 2021, they kind of did this huge off-season signing, bringing in all this talent. They made it to the semifinals, lost in overtime to Carolina. In 2022, they were even better, right? They make it all the way to a championship game. They actually played New York pretty close through the first 2.5 quarters of that game. I always forget it until I go back and watch it, but it's like Union Union were hanging around longer than I think the
Small
memory.
margins that game.
Yeah. But eventually New York kind of just piled on some breaks and really opened the margins and won by a comfortable amount. But Chicago team, you know, Dave Wood said it a few weeks ago. They're on a revenge tour, head coach of the Union, talking about this year, kind of where their mindset is. Pavel Giannis has been all over any camera media reply section you can find him in, talking about, you know, that they're going to stomp Minnesota, that was a false title that the Wind Chill won in 2024. I mean, I don't know that I've seen this much bluster coming into a season. And my question for you is, how much of that is matched in what they're going to do on the field? Like, is this team as real as all this noise right now?
It's a good question. Talent-wise, they are as good as anybody in the league. And it's partly the guys that they are bringing back from 21 and 22 that you mentioned, and partly the guys that they are adding. You know, Brandon Van Dusen is a national team caliber young handler. Now, he's coming off an injury that ended his season last year, so who knows exactly where he'll be physically coming into 2025. But, like, arguably Van Dusen is a bigger deal for Chicago's handling success in 2025 than Pavel. You know, Victor Luo, really solid, versatile UFA player. I mean, he's one of those. Xavier Payne and Simon Dastrup, another young athlete coming from Salt Lake City with Chicago roots. You know, you talked about Don DeMarais, who might have been, you know, the best player in Europe and one of the best players in the world last year that folks haven't necessarily seen compete yet at this level. Sofiane Bontemps, and I struggle with the pronunciation of his name, he's another really talented player, former moon catcher, who was phenomenal at Worlds a few years ago. So, look, they have the talent. What will their buy-in be like? Mm-hmm. What will their continuity be like? You know, the Minnesota Wind Chill, the other top contender in the Central Division, and it really feels like a two-team race at this point, with all due respect to Madison and Pittsburgh, who may be a little frisky racing for that 3 spot. We'll see.
Hey, both those teams, if Chicago and Minnesota aren't careful, Madison and Pittsburgh will pick them off. I'm confident enough in Pittsburgh reassembling most of their offense from last year. That was really stable. And I just thought they did a really good job of playing up to their potential. And same with Madison. They're young. They're going to get after you defensively. Like, if you have an off night passing, they're going to run up those break scores on you.
Yeah. So I wouldn't say I trust Chicago yet. I am not confident that they are going to look like the best team in the league early in the season. However, at some point, talent rises up. And if they can stay healthy and if they can put it together, I think they're the more talented team than Minnesota. But again, despite what Pavel Giannis says about it's all about talent and this being performance sports, coaching matters and team unification matters and adaptability in adverse circumstances matters.
See, all of that to me has arrows pointing in spades towards Minnesota. Like, those
well, and that's the reason. That's the reason why the Wind Chill won last year, Adam.
Right.
Because they were able to adapt better than the DC Breeze and the Carolina Flyers, who arguably, at least at the time going into championship weekend last year, there was an external kind of perception that DC and Carolina were more talented than Minnesota. Now,
you Minnesota, that. I think everyone acknowledges that. And that's even what I was going to counter with your point saying that talent prevails. I don't know that we're seeing that necessarily as much anymore. I think that some of the pulling rules that changed after the 2022 season and that Minnesota has so seriously harnessed as far as their power has really sort of altered some of the format. You see a lot more upsets. You see Pittsburgh knocking off Minnesota in Minnesota last year. You see Minnesota taking advantage of the wind and the chaos of championship weekend to upset the two most talented teams in that bracket. Like, that's kind of my counter to Chicago, is that, sure, we can sit here and name names all day long. Union's got that on their roster, but do they have the practices? Do they have the back end? Do they have this kind of institutional framework that Minnesota has been building now for half a decade? Like, this is stuff that has been paying off, that were seeded long ago. I mean, even before the pandemic. I mean, this is a team that has known its culture and its core, for 6-7 years. This Union team shifts every couple. And like, I want to see, to your point, where that talent kind of meshes, because I also have all the questions for the Chicago players who did really well last year that kind of figure to have reduced roles.
What does it mean for Sam Kaminsky this year?
Yeah, right. Like, where does he fit in? He's a captain, but you look at what their offensive rotation is kind of scattering out to be, and I don't exactly know where he's going to fit in. So does he go to D-line? Are they just going to start kind of piling up these reserves on D-line rotations? Like, the other question I have too, kind of to your question about buying and stuff, some of these players, Van Dusen, Goff, Arters, they miss time. These aren't, the Steele award-winning, play every game kind of guys. There are times in which the hamstring flares, the back flares. Like, are they going to be available for the games that they have to win so that they don't have to go on the road in the playoffs? Because that's the other thing that I think it's really undersold in some of this talent versus everything else discussion is, sure, fine, Danny, you have the most talented team. You've now got to play an extra game because you botched 1 or 2 additional regular season games that you weren't supposed to. So you've got to play either a road first round game or you've got to host one. And then you have to go on the road and play in the divisional title game. Now, I know recent history, last year there were 2 away teams that won divisional title games. So, take it with a grain of salt. But I'm saying, like, those are adverse conditions. You don't want to be in that scenario to go on the road and have to win in this association. Like, I think that matters, especially if your opponent's Minnesota. Playing in Minnesota is difficult. Chicago has done it better than any other team in recent years, but it's still not an easy place to go get W. So I don't know. I see everything the Union is amassing, but again, it's like, until it plays out in front of me, I don't know. Like, and it's kind of to the point of, where are all these Union pieces going to fit? Like, Woods is a fantastic coach. I trust them to figure out the rotations. That isn't what I'm interested in. What I'm interested in is how they gel quickly, because on the flip side, Minnesota's like completely rebooted their championship roster. There was a couple questions if like Matt Rader would rejoin. He's back. A couple of other question marks. They're all back. They add in Justin Burnett and James Pollard, 2 great fits for their team. You're talking about Burnett, who's on back-to-back all-defense teams, and then Pollard, another puller that they get to add potentially to their defensive lineup. That leaves Philly as its most illustrious puller in franchise history. So they get another weapon to add to Cameron Lacey, who's an all-defensive nomination, and Sam Berglund, who will, I think, be healthy in 2025. Like, this Minnesota team's plugging in players into roles that they know will fit them. Union, like, they have these pods. There's sort of these 4 and 5 group assemblages that make sense when you play them together. But those 4, 5, 6, 7 players on the roster or the lineup, like, how are they going to fare against Minnesota? And, the wind chill players know their roles to a T. Like, I want to see the Union be able to do that. I don't agree that talent just wipes all of that clean. Like, I'm sorry, Pavel. Screw that. I'm not apologizing to Pavel. Nobody apologized to Pavel. But, like, talent doesn't just persist. If that was true, why doesn't Chicago have a title yet then?
Yeah. Especially in club. That's a cheap shot right there.
I'm saying, bro, the illustrious Chicago Ultimate program, right? So many titles coming out of that city. They've just always cashed in on the checks that their mouths have been writing.
Let me respond to a few things you said. First of all, a while ago you said Chicago's played as well at Minnesota as anybody. New York has something to say about that, both against the wind chill and in Minnesota at championship weekend. I think Chicago has a win in each of the last 3 seasons at Minnesota, or to me the last 4 or something. That's all. the thing about the wind chill that I am most excited about, it's not Burnett and Pollard or Rader coming back. And I'm excited about those guys. They're going to be impact players. It is the young crew of 24 and under guys being a year older with the championship level reps and confidence gained from last year, like Will Brandt, championship weekend MVP, young University of Minnesota star Paul Krennick, Thomas Shope, who was just 18 years old last year. They
Gordon
have
Larson,
Gordon. I mean, they just have so many
Silva
young, like
Fernandez, like that kid is smooth, man. Like Silva Fernandez is one of those pieces you put over there and you trust him and you just let him go to work.
The next generation of wind chill core, like the future is now, and the future was ahead of schedule last year. They all had impactful roles in winning a title ahead of schedule. So I am excited for that growth that we're going to see from that group of players. Look, the biggest challenge for any team after winning a title is finding the same hunger to do it the next year. And in the UFA, obviously, every game is going to matter. You talk about the importance of home field. I agree. It is important. Minnesota's got a really tough schedule. They have to go to Salt Lake. They have Atlanta coming to them, so does Chicago for that matter. I think it's going to be a really fascinating race. Minnesota and Chicago only play 2 or 3 times during the regular season. I think it's just twice, but now I'm second guessing myself in my head after staring at the schedule for too many hours.
They played 3 times last year. They played twice this year.
Yeah, I think it's just twice. And one of them is on the 4th of July, Friday Night Frisbee. Looking forward to that. Yeah. So here's a bigger picture question that I can pose to you. Like, the Central Division as a whole has never been viewed as being comparable to the East or the South.
Correct.
Maybe the West. Does that change now with Minnesota and Chicago looking as strong as they are? Let's forget about the bottom of the division for a second. Let's talk about the top 2 or 3. Is the top 2 in the Central comparable to New York, DC, Boston, or Carolina, Atlanta? Like, are those similar kind of dynamics and rivalries right now where you can think, all right, DC, New York, and Minnesota, Chicago, those games are kind of on the same level? Or is DC, New York still a step above and the Central kind of needs to prove itself? Because despite winning the title last year, which they absolutely deserved, before that, Central hadn't won a game at championship weekend, I guess, since Chicago beat a flustered Colorado team in the semifinals in Madison 2022. Before that, it had been a while.
Yeah. I think to your point about the top 2 in each division, yes, I think we can definitively say that Chicago, Minnesota rivals Carolina, Atlanta, and whatever combination of Boston, DC, and New York you kind of want to put in that rock, paper, scissors. I think where it becomes interesting is when you start bringing in the West, because Colorado obviously just had a fantastic offseason, felt like they kind of underperformed last year due to injuries, availability, whatever else. Kind of feels like they're going to have a resurgence this year. Salt Lake got absolutely whacked by the injury bug last year. They stand to be healthier. And yet you've got the reigning division champs in Seattle who have re-signed, I think, a majority of the playmakers that were impactful for them last year, but still have a lot of question marks, I think, for their 2025 roster. Yeah, I think when you look across the landscape, you can say that like Minnesota, Chicago deserves to be on the equal footing of Boston, DC. It's just that, yeah, I don't know what it is that doesn't like elevate it aesthetically in my head to the same level. I think it's probably the playoff encounters, just the way in which the DC New York games have gone, even last year with Boston, New York. There's a payoff to those rivalries that is so spectacular. It's been a couple years since we've had that with Minnesota, Chicago. There's been some great regular season battles, but I mean, the 2022 Central Division title game, that wasn't particularly close. The 2021 one was the fabulous Union comeback at home in order for Chicago to get their first championship weekend appearance. And other than that, they've never really played in the playoffs. And so I think you just need to maybe see more of that postseason attrition between these two franchises. I don't know what it is. I think it's kind of, gold rubs off on gold. Like they need to spar at this level a couple more times for it to really sink in. This is the premier rivalry, right?
Let me rephrase the question to the power ranking czar of the Ultimate Frisbee Association. Obviously, we don't know rosters fully. There are rumors about certain signings that hopefully we'll get more information about in the coming weeks, and the landscape is still kind of in the whirlwind reshuffling right now. But with what we know right now, give me your top three. I know you were working on power rankings because you were telling me how difficult it is. Today, who's your top three? And really the question is relevant or related to the Central. Are either Chicago or Minnesota in your top three preseason league-wide power rankings 2025 at the end of February?
So I'll pull back the curtain here a little bit and reveal that I've got Minnesota 1 because they're the reigning champs and they're bringing back pretty much everybody. Those ingredients alone, I feel like, are enough to put them atop the list, especially with so many questions elsewhere. It's like, okay, I know one thing. Minnesota took care of business when they needed to. That was the last set of games we watched. It's the most recent data points I have available. Everyone's coming back. We'll just put them at 1. We're putting them at 1. I know Pavel's screaming somewhere. I've waffled on number 2 so hard. I think I originally had DC. I think I cycled up Chicago with Elijah Long and Alan Laviolette returning to Carolina this week. I've considered putting Carolina there at number 2 because they were the runner-up last year, and I just have a faith in that Flyers institution. I know they're changing coaches over from DeNardis to Michael Avila, but I don't doubt the Flyers. Outside of New York, they probably have the best resume of any franchise over the past 5 seasons in this league. So I considered them. Atlanta is bringing in all these goal scorers, with Cameron Brock and Alec Wilson-Holiday. There's reports of some others joining as well. I'm interested to see how their lineups shake up because I still want to see how the Bobby Lay hole gets filled. I thought that Austin Taylor, Bobby Lay connection really fueled that Atlanta offense, and I want to see how that gets solved. Now
Aiden Downey can have a big year.
I don't know that Downey is returning to the hustle. I have a rumor that he might be joining an East team. The East has like 3 powder keg additions. 2 will be confirmed next week. Downey might be another. This offseason movement is hard to keep a handle on. And anyways, I'm just rambling now through teams. I know I've totally avoided the top.
So who's the top 3? Who's your top
Minnesota,
3 right now?
Minnesota. DC hasn't announced anyone, which is what's so frustrating. We'll go Minnesota, DC, Chicago. And I don't like it already because I'm just thinking of Boston and New York in the back of my head. I had Boston, DC, and New York all in the top 5 to end last year's regular season, and that felt correct. It did feel like those 3 teams, if you put them into a blender, they could just it just kind of depended on matchups as to who would win in certain games.
So here's the crazy thing, Adam. And look, you said Minnesota, DC, Chicago. I think I could give you a top 3 that doesn't have any of those teams in it.
Yeah, then I'd nod with you.
I think, just for the sake of argument, let's say I got New York number 1. I think they're going to have a bounce back year. New York number 1, Atlanta 2, Carolina 3. Like maybe DC 4, Chicago 5, Minnesota 6, and then you got to start thinking about Colorado, Salt. So I get it's hard, and that's really the point. Is that there are more teams than ever in the mix, which is awesome, and it's great for fan support and engagement. Like just the the mystery of the 2025 season going into it. It's look, what, like 3 of the last 6 UFA seasons have been New York going undefeated, not without some drama along the way, for sure. And excellence is great, but it feels like right now we've got, 8, 9, maybe even 10 teams that could make a real compelling case that they could be playing in the championship game in August at Bree Stevens Field. And I don't feel like we've had this wide open of a competitive landscape ever in the history of the league. And look, maybe in the next couple of months before the season begins, the window starts to close a little bit because we see, New York is really loaded up, or Chicago adds somebody else, or maybe Aiden Downey's going to Boston, or I don't know. I hadn't heard anything about Aiden Downey, but I think he's a really, really good young player. And I'm kind of disappointed because I was excited to see what he and Adam Miller could do together with the hustle for so many years. Like but like every team has questions too, right? Like we talked about Chicago's questions. How are they going to fit? Atlanta, how are they going to replace Bobby Lay and Matt Smith? And how are
Minnesota
2 guys
turnover troubles? Minnesota evaded their biggest weakness at championship weekend because that wind made everyone struggle with possession. But Minnesota coming into championship weekend, that was the knock, was that they would have these games where all of a sudden it was like, oops, we have 20 plus turnovers. Like that's what happened against New York. They just kept giving the disc away to the Empire. And
that's why I didn't have Minnesota number 1 on my power rankings.
But they kind of got a little bit of a pass at championship weekend because everyone just got destroyed by that win. There wasn't an idea that you could just come in and possess the disc. Ask DC. I've never seen DC Ultimate melt down like that weather made them do. I mean, they were in panic mode. It's a team that never panics. I love your point. Like there are questions for every one of these teams. I think that's the other thing that was so hard in assembling the power rankings is sure you can stack up team strengths, but what I always try to rely on more so is what is the big unanswerable thing and how sort of cumbersome is that for me to get around? And go ahead.
I want to dig a little bit more, just go a little bit more broad. Like I'm going to give you 4 teams and tell me how you kind of have them in your mind in the hierarchy in the preseason.
Okay.
Toronto, Pittsburgh, San Diego, and Oakland.
I thought you were going to say Madison there because they're like these are the
Toronto, Pittsburgh, San Diego, Oakland.
Yeah, no, I mean, these are the teams that are the true mezcla teams. Like, same with Colorado, I would even throw in here, or Seattle. Like, what happens at their, like, topmost, right? Like, what is the absolute potential? To me, of the 4 you just listed, Toronto, Pitt, San Diego, Oakland, Toronto clearly has the highest ceiling. Given the amount of talent that they're importing from Europe, given the returners that they're bringing back, like Mike McKenzie, the Lewis brothers, like Ty Barbieri, like, these are legit players who have never really been in rotation with each other who are finally now all on the rush together. And, we've been hyping up De Marais. We've been hyping up other international stars. Arvids Karklins might be the best one of them all, and he's going to get a full green light on this Toronto team. I'm really excited to see what
I should have said him instead of Nate Goff. Like, you want Rodney Adams or Arvids Karklins?
I want Arvids, man. Arvids. Who's not an Arvids fan when they watch him play? Like he can kind of do it all. And so I think you look at the 4 teams you just mentioned, the Rush are the most intriguing to me. What's problematic for them is that they have to sort of gestate in this petri dish of the East. So they're going to be having to form these lineups and rotations and rhythms playing 3 of the best defenses in the entire league in DC, Boston, and New York. And that's I think my worry for Toronto is just that they're going to be born under punches, man. Like it is going to be adversity forming this team given all of the various components of it. But I really like what I see on paper from the Rush. Pittsburgh, I see very much similar to last year. If they can continue to take care of games in front of them and not drop a couple.
They got a tough one at Detroit early in the season.
What?
They get a tough one at Detroit early in the season, though.
But like, they lose by 1 against Madison at Madison in a game they could have won last year. They had 1 or 2 other games where like they didn't have the lineup that they needed. Obviously, they lose to Detroit, and they essentially kind of shoot themselves in the foot out of that third and final playoff spot in the Central. I mean, I could see Pittsburgh being feisty for that. They're bringing back the main components of their throwing core and offense, which is solid, and Drehaus and Hoffenkamp, the 2 rookies, and then Jonathan Mass. Like, that's a solid foundation to work from. They're not going to wow anybody, but like they also didn't turn the disc over a ton. They had that terrific performance against Indy at home last year. So I could see Pittsburgh being another, 4 to 6 win team. San Diego is kind of my wild card. I have them just outside of the top 10 right now, but where they were playing at the end of last year and who they've kind of brought in this year with KJ Koo, I think, on board for the full season, Marcel Osborne, Jesse Cohen's back on board. Like, they've got some more playmaking and verve. Like, you talk about a team who gets a little underrated until you look at their coaching staff. San Diego is that. I mean, Stewart and Kayla Helton, that is as good of a sideline as you could want in this league. They coach everyone up. They have young players playing to an excellent level. If Max Gibson kind of gets going again, I mean, I know we kind of forgot about him last year a little bit. They platooned him a little bit more in defense, but he's 6'6" and can run, man. He can throw too. If he figures it out a little bit, like, that's a big weapon. He had, I think, like 60 scores as a rookie 2 years ago. Like, San Diego's fun. And then Oakland, I don't know, man. I mean, they're going to be.
You said before that Toronto has the highest ceiling, and with the players that have been announced right now, sure.
Yeah.
Oakland is kind of this. Obviously, the Bay Area is a haven for high-level ultimate. Like when the Spiders and Flamethrowers loaded up, they were the best teams in the league and won titles. Can the Oakland Spiders rekindle that? And look, they've made a coaching change. They kind of threw Dan Silverstein aside, and they're bringing in Caleb Merriam, who I have not spoken to yet in the preseason. And I know that they're working on trying to get the best version of Bay Area Ultimate to represent the Spiders in the UFA. Whether that happens or not remains to be seen. I'm not plugged in. I'll try to be more plugged in the future. But I think, their ceiling is as high as anybody of that quartet I mentioned. And look, I gave you 4 teams that I think the general public would probably say are the 4th place teams in the 4 divisions right now, going into the season from a perception standpoint. So if I said over under 1.5 of those 4 teams are going to make the playoffs, you go over, you go under, and which of the 4 or which of the 4 do you think get there? Or your facial expression says you're going under, and
it's just tough. It's just tough. Like, how do you displace any of the 3 teams in the East from where they are without visible results? Like, that's just what I go back to with the East and Toronto. Like, that's the most like prove it team to me. They're going to be born under fire. They've got to just do it. Where it gets interesting is, again, like Pittsburgh's schedule. I'd have to go and look. I think that they actually have a pretty favorable schedule, all things considered. And so they might just be able to pick up some cheap Detroit wins that keep them viable for a playoff spot. San Diego and Oakland, I think, are where it really gets interesting, because you talk about San Diego now being in the South Division. Remember, they are no longer in the West. I'm saying that as much for myself out loud as the listening audience. But San Diego, I think with, Austin looking like they might have a depreciated roster this year, and San Diego kind of, I think, out from underneath some of the Western expansion elements that I think have sort of displaced them from where they won back-to-back West Division titles not too long ago. I think that the Growlers are intriguing. You talk about Oakland. I love that you bring up their potential, because you're right. Like, you see the glimpses. You see Raekwon Adkins, going downfield. He averaged the 2nd most receiving yards per game in the league last year. He's averaging like 360 a game. He exploded in that first round playoff game at Seattle. Cascades couldn't really do much to slow him down. Evan Magsig made an all-UFA team last year. One of the best all-around throwers in the league. Like, there are pieces here that I really like. just with Oakland again, like how many different iterations of their offense and defense do we see?
Yeah, it's about commitment and buy-in for them and
Yeah.
developing kind of the focus and chemistry to match, a team like Salt Lake, who is kind of the epitome of that in the West Division, that in terms of being bought in and focused and together and just committed to training to be at the best on game day. I think that was the biggest difference with Seattle last year and Seattle 3-4 years ago. And, Garrett Martin talked about the end of the season last year, how, we put in the seeds in 2023. We didn't necessarily get the results, but we were a good team. And that level of commitment and buy-in and focus got them where they were in 2024. But yeah, look, after Seattle did what they did to Salt Lake, and after what Minnesota did to Carolina and DC, every single kind of fringe team that hasn't had the recent level of accomplishment is thinking, why not us in 2025? And there are a half dozen why not us teams that believe that they can make a run to championship weekend that probably folks are thinking, yeah, they're not even going to make the playoffs. So that level of preseason belief going into this year, it's, as I said before, like a perfect storm for people, having anticipation and just kind of generating a confidence. And look, the first couple of weeks of the season for some of these teams are going to be a damn rude awakening because you have all this optimism in the preseason. That's my biggest takeaway every year as I talk to coaches and players around the league. And practice is going great. We got new systems. You should see the athleticism. This guy's in the best shape of his life. And, the famous Mike Tyson quote, everybody's got a great plan until you get punched in the face. And with the way the schedules are orchestrated, there are going to be some competitive games early in the season. Teams are going to get punched in the face. And, some schedules are particularly unrelenting. The Atlanta Hustle need to beat the Salt Lake Shred in week 1 at home. If they don't, they're staring 2-5 right in the face with the challenges that they've got ahead.
Salt Lake last year, and they beat DC at home, and they were 6-0, and then injuries and everything else started to pile up, and then they lose at home in the playoffs to Seattle, who nobody had picked to win that division.
I still can't believe how that game transpired. And Salt Lake's another team, Adam. We haven't seen a ton of roster news from them. Maybe you know more than I do. I have not talked to Bryce Merrill in the preseason yet. I need to give Bryce a call and catch up. I have grown to trust his leadership and the infrastructure of their, they've had double-digit wins each of the past couple of years. There's just kind of a level of professionalism with that team that you expect them to have the horses. Mm-hmm. And they had a lot of issues up here late in the season last year with their best players. And they're not going to have Joe Merrill. You mentioned the injuries from last year. He was one of the big names you're focused on. Joe told me on a Live with Lep episode, he's planning on sitting out this 2025 season because of the injury that he suffered last year. Now he's going to be in a coaching role, but Joe Merrill solved a lot of problems for them. And then when he was not there, it created a bunch of problems. So, can Jordan Kerr get his mojo back? Can Will Selfridge, who had the disc on the goal line with the game on the line and did not come through, tremendously talented young player, but it's the same thing with Brett Holzmeyer in Atlanta. These uber talented guys that need to get over the hump. We trust them to do it physically, but can they do it mentally?
See, I think for Salt Lake, what it comes back to me is testing what I was saying earlier in regards to Chicago. I was challenging this notion that just talent can wipe away any wrinkles or mistakes elsewhere and is kind of the ultimate truth that exists in the background of our sports performance experiment or whatever, right? I think you see last year with Salt Lake sort of the inverse of that, where I think that by the time that West Division title game happened, Seattle had more talent on the field due to injuries and whatever else than Salt Lake. And I think you saw the limitations of the system sort of run into the Seattle team that was just younger, hungrier, and running around on a shred team that was beat up, kind of playing out of position. And like you say, struggling through, I think, the thinking aspect of all of a sudden, oh, shoot, I'm not just sort of point and shooting to the next available player. I'm thinking through, do I want to throw to this person on the Sunder? And that's just where, everything becomes a mess, and then you're not playing to your strengths. And I think you saw that, especially with the shred offense last year. I mean, I think New York sort of showed the blueprint of what to do, which is really become aggressive on those first looks and try to take the disc away on the quick passes that the shred like to utilize. And once teams started to do that, you're right, it became this whole thing up here that the shred just couldn't get past. I think they will be able to do that now with their season reset, but I do have questions about this roster. There's going to be some announcements of who they're losing, and they're going to be missing some pretty significant chunks to their O-line. So I again, it's one of those things where they've won 10 plus regular season games each of their first 3 seasons. I think that they're going to be pretty much a lock as a playoff contender. It's just, are they sort of the team that looked like it had the best chance of challenging the Empire dynasty 2 years ago? Or is it the team that fell apart in the back half of 2024 and couldn't get out of their own way? I do think that the shred have shown both versions, and without knowing who's playing in particular roles on their lineups, I mean, they're always going to be punchy though. Like when haven't the shred been in a game? Well, except against New York last year, just that one.
Yeah. You called them a lock for the playoffs, and they're definitely a favorite to make the playoffs. I think the divisions are all so deep, and our uncertainty is so high, and could Oakland really revamp their roster in a way that makes them, look a little bit like Chicago out in the West? Like, my locks for the playoff right now are Chicago and Minnesota, just because the bottom of the Central doesn't feel like, it feels like there's a huge gap there. But like every other division, like Carolina, Atlanta, I think are probably, they're definitely favorites for the playoffs. But with Atlanta's schedule and with Carolina losing some of the names that you mentioned and bringing in a new coach, like there are enough question marks that make me I think Chicago and Minnesota are locks for the playoffs. You can pencil in that the Central Division title game will be in either Chicago or Minnesota one of those weekends. Radicals, prove me wrong. Be exciting. Love Bree Stevens Field. But Bree Stevens' magic needs to return in an even bigger way than it did last year for that to happen in the Central. I just don't think there are that many locks right now because, look, in the East Division, I think if we get the best version of Toronto, they will be good enough on paper to beat either DC or New York or Boston. Now, can they pile up and stack up enough wins together to make the playoffs over one of those teams? I think they could. I'm not sure who's the odd man out in that division. I have no idea. But I think, right now, Toronto, just by the past, you got to think that you go with the 3 teams that made it last year. Again, it's a fascinating time in this league, and we still have a lot of cloudiness and murkiness and question marks. And hopefully,
major player news that will be breaking.
Hopefully, we'll get more answers in the next, 4 to 6 weeks. But frankly, I don't know if those answers are going to make it any less cloudy. It might make it even more cloudy in terms of trying to prognosticate what is going to happen. And I think you've learned about me. I like being right, but I'm totally fine being wrong. And I try to address things with nuance, but I also say what I think. And I'm just excited for the season, man. April 24th, shout out to my wife because that's her birthday. And I'm going to be out west for the Spiders and the Empire on opening night. And I need to figure out a way to, make that okay. But I got some time to do that. And it's going to be a really fun opening weekend. And look, like even a team like Vegas, like who the heck knows what they're going to be? Like I don't expect them to be very good, but it's interesting, right?
Yeah.
And just there's so many interesting things. Like I've talked to Brent Steep, the owner of the Detroit Mechanix, pretty much every preseason going back a number of years. We haven't had our like full preseason debrief this year, but like I'm
Uh-huh.
sure he's going to be feeling good and optimistic, and it's one of those things you got to see it to believe it. But Indy has lost a lot of players. Could Detroit supplant Indy and win a few games this year and maybe be a little frisky? Like I don't think so, but I'm certainly not counting it out. And the Philadelphia Phoenix, like, there's some Ewing theory potential with a guy like James Pollard and some other guys that they've lost, and they've got a new coaching
They
staff.
just
And
got better around them, though. Like, that's the problem for Philly, is that everything else went like this over the offseason. I mean, even Toronto, who Philly was kind of feeding off of the past couple of years, that's not going to be the case anymore. So,
yeah,
I was
anyway,
just going to say, as long as you're okay being wrong, you're going to fit in just fine on this show, brother. Like, don't you worry about that.
all right. That's reassuring. I was pretty nervous about that. There is a scorecard at the end of every show that you'll be keeping track of, right? To
Oh yeah. I
our
actually rubric graded out. I was just
yeah.
gonna say, you talk about everything being so up in the air. I was thinking it kind of gets back to what I was saying about Rodney Adams too. It's like, check in with me after Memorial Day, man. This whole opening month is just gonna be such a lab as far as experimenting what all of this means, right? Like to your point, I don't think we've ever had, I don't want to say like uncertainty, because it's not that. It's like intrigue heading into a season from so many different angles. Usually we have to almost distill it down to like, okay, we talk about undefeated New York and the two teams that can challenge them. And this year it's just like, which way do you kind of go at this from? I mean, which team's lens do you sort of pick? I
Was
think
that
it's
was that voice like 2022 Ruffner, or was it 2021 Cohen? What was that voice?
what voice?
We've got New York and two teams that they can challenge
Oh, I
them.
don't
And
know. I'm probably just slipping into gravitas, but like, yeah. I mean, like there's so many different ways to sort of dissect this cake. I'm just intrigued to see how it's all gonna mesh, and I know we've now got what 12 weeks, 8 weeks, somewhere in there. I don't pay attention to calendars right now.
12
We're
weeks to
on the
Memorial Day.
calendar
We're less than
close.
2 months away from the start of the season, brother.
I know. Well, I meant towards the beginning of the season. How many weeks are we at? Like 8, 10? I know
Yeah,
it's
but
I know it's over 50 days till April
you
24th.
you and I are talking on Thursday, February 27th. The season starts 8 weeks from tonight in
All
Oakland.
right. 8 weeks. That'll be our ending note then for this week. 8 weeks until the start of the 2025 season on April 24th. That'll do it for Evan and I on this episode of Swing Pass. We'll be joining you next week to hopefully recap a heap of news coming out of the East Division, some major player signings that you're going to be wanting to watch out there. We'll talk to you soon. Bye for now.
Thanks, y'all.